Welcome to the Animal Aspirations Podcast. In this episode, we speak to Dan Chan, a professor at the RVC and a man with many titles. As one of the members of the Race and Equality Task Group, we talk about why this group was created and what it hopes to accomplish. With the continuing theme of support, we talk about the importance of implementing communication and reflection work in the curriculum to give students the language and skills to speak up for themselves, as well as personal development. This is a very insightful episode, and I really hope you enjoy it. Welcome to the Animal Aspirations Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks a lot for having me. So my name is Dan Chan, and I am an emergency vet by training. Been at the RVC for 16 years now. And I started off as a lecturer in emergency and critical care. And over the years, I've acquired different roles. So I was head of section for emergency critical care for several years, then became the clinical director of the Queen Mother Hospital for Animals before becoming head of department for the clinical science and services, which oversees all the clinical units for the college. And I'm also the BVET Med Year 4 leader and also the rotations director. So I've acquired quite a few roles in my time, but and then that's what I do.
That's a lot of titles under your name. That's very impressive. Well done. My first question to you is, what was your journey into veterinary?
Yeah, so it's a really good sort of a question to get people to talk about how they come upon becoming a vet. So I guess I never grew up thinking I wanted to be a vet, and I hear a lot of students that tell me that they did want, and I couldn't really relate that. I knew I wanted to do science and I liked animals, but I almost thought more of like the David Attenboroughs of the world than James Herriot. And it wasn't until high school, because I grew up in the States, that I know someone said at class while we're talking about what you want to do, and somebody said something like, it's harder to be a vet than a doctor. And I got like, oh, that's interesting. Why is that? And so that was the first sort of idea that there might be something that I might want to get into that's more challenging. So it wasn't until high school that I actually thought of going for vet. And I grew up in New York. And so I actually did a program that was sort of like almost agricultural in nature, which was kind of odd to being from New York City to be looking at that. But they had animal science in that, like, oh, that's something to get into. And in there, that's why they talked about like, well, this is really hard to become a vet. So it was a bit of a challenge that was sort of laid down. And I thought, I could take that on. And not to be stereotypical, but my parents were very dubious about this plan because, like, you sure you don't want to be a doctor, and I think a lot of people might relate to that. But, they were okay letting me pursue. My sisters, my brother and I were the first to go to university in our family. And all of us have sort of done college postgraduate degrees. So it was, they were okay with that. And so I applied and got into Cornell University. So that's where I did my vet degree. And again, when I got in, I actually didn't know what I'm going to do, but very early on, and it could be because like the show ER was on and emergency medicine was kind of exciting. And I was like, is there such a thing as emergency medicine in veterinary work? And it was. And so I became quite passionate about that. And that was my in. And so basically just done emergency and critical care work most of my career, and helped develop the program here. So from the States where I trained, came over here and sort of helped develop the program that started before I got here. And now it's the largest program in Europe and one of the largest emergency critical care programs in the world. So that's been really good to be part of.
That's really interesting that you helped build such a like name. Like for me applying to the RVC, that was one of the things I was like, wow, like this whole unit that's amazing. Like that you're gonna get amazing teaching there. So that's really interesting to hear that you are one of the like pioneers in creating that. I wanted to talk a little bit about your role specifically relating to the task force and how that was started, why it was implemented, and what your kind of aims were for it for people who don't really know anything about it.
Yeah, so I think we need to acknowledge that what precipitated the creation of the Race Equality Task Group was the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think it was almost unique in this day and age for an event as sad as it was, to prompt everyone to pause and think, where are we? And there was quite a bit of anger, dissatisfaction by people affected by it. But then the people that are also affected are the people that actually didn't know what to do with what was happening. And I think almost every organization decided that, okay, I think this is the time to really listen and take action. Because I think most organizations will say, we've always supported this and it's not new. But I think what people were demanding was, say, then show me the action. What is actually happening? So that was the critical point in time where every organization had to do a bit of reflection and say, okay, how are we going to engage with this process to get something changed? And the students union at the RVC were very vocal about asking for that, saying, okay, show me the action. So the Race Equality Task Group was formed at the bequest of the principal in response to the students union sort of request for action. And the Equality Diversity Committee, which was longstanding, basically said, okay, I think this is how we're going to achieve some change, and it requires a little bit of analysis of where we are, where we want to be. So I was asked and feel very honored to be part of that. And I think it's fair to say that it's not something that I can say, oh, I've always been an advocate for equality. It's actually the whole period of time made people think, what have I done to advance this really? And I felt that given the fact that I progressed through the organization and may or may not been affected in some way, that I felt that I'm in a position to give a platform. And what I wanted to do is make sure that the process included the voices of everyone that were affected. And rather than trying to second guess what people that have been affected by discrimination and racism would want to see, I wanted to be sure that their voices were the driving force behind it. So the task group was set as a small group, and the amount of work that this small group had to do, we had like 24 meetings to finish off what we were set out to do, which is create this report. And I'm very happy to say that the report has been completed and submitted to the RVC Council, the principal, and it's making its way so that it will be, looked upon as saying, okay, this might be the recommendations from the task group. So that's what I wanted to achieve, is making sure that it captured the voices of the people most affected. But we also had to look across the sector, because we didn't have to reinvent the wheel. There were things that are being put in place across the sector. And I thought, we have the opportunity to look at these things and say, actually, can we apply this here? Can we enact this change? And during this time, there was a lot of positive reception to say, yes, that's something we want to do. And I think I'm hoping that the momentum created by it will have really long-lasting impact.
I think something that's really interesting that you brought up was about including everyone's voices. And I think a big thing about like passing the mic, like if you can't speak, not everyone under the bracket BAME, even though politically that's a bit of a word, because what does that even mean? But if we're going with the stereotypical BAME bracket, there are so many different people with different experiences, and being able to represent all of them in a small committee is obviously going to be very difficult. But understanding that you have it's passing the mic, so hearing like what people do want, like what can we do to help. I think that's really interesting that was one of the things that was at the forefront of like creating the task group. That was like, if we're going to do this, we're going to do this properly, and we need to be able to represent as many people as possible. So I think that's really interesting to hear. What I wanted to ask is, what was your like mindset coming into the task force? Because obviously you said it was during the Black Lives Matter movement of 2020 summer. Like, what did you feel when you were asked to take on this challenge? Did you feel like apprehensive? Did you think like, no, this is something we can achieve? Because obviously like in tackling institutional racism is a very large task that's not going to be fixed by one task force. But what was your like, what did you think coming into taking on this role?
No, I think apprehension was probably a good way to describe it, because for those of us that kind of live with this, it is hard to see that it would be like, oh, it'll be a task group and it'll be ended. Like, I think realistically, we knew a lot of the people in the task group are from minority backgrounds. So we kind of knew that this is not about like snapping your fingers and everything will be gone. But it's making sure that it was meaningful, that it was bold, rather than status quo and dress it up saying, yes, we're all for equality. How do you make that mean something?
Yeah.
And mean something to the people that for many years didn't feel that was true.
Yeah.
And I think the difference was about, as you mentioned, you can't capture everyone's experience. But what was interesting is there unifying sort of themes that every group can relate to, rather than saying, well, Black, African, Caribbean had one experience that's very different than South Asian versus, Chinese. And it wasn't about, having a tick box for every group. It was about what is unifying about it. And, one of the things that I also sort of the part of the journey was about is intersectionality that involved discrimination in different levels. So it was sort of in tandem with equality even among the sexes as well, and being able to raise the platform and the discussion that should be normal to challenge, why is there a problem institutionally about the ability of anyone to progress or feel excluded? And so those were the common unifying themes that I thought that the task group was able to capitalize on and produce something that most people can agree that represents a part of their issues.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting hearing that as a student, because for me, coming into it, like in this, like where I am in my journey in like the time frame of history, yes, there is discrimination and racism, but it's not as bad as it used to be. As in, like in my year, there are people of ethnic minorities. There's not a lot, but there are. Whereas I've spoken to other vets and they were the only one in their vet schools. So they would have had to face more. So hearing that, I think one thing with diversity work is that people always expect changes quickly. And that's not always the case. Like a lot of these things, like you said, momentum has to be continued and it takes a long time. And it's not something you're going to see in the span of like a year, 2 years, 5 years. So I think even seeing a change of perspective and, willingness to do these sorts of things from like generations of vets who are currently practicing to people my age who are currently studying to practice eventually now, I think there's already been such a big shift. And I hope that the momentum continues to grow like that. But do you feel like the student body now is more vocal than it used to be? Because obviously you've been at the RVC for 16 years. Have you noticed a difference in like the attitudes of students?
That's a really interesting question, because there's definitely truth to that, but also the fact that the levels of what counted as discriminatory or racist sort of attitudes, the threshold has changed, and it probably sort of generational. Because when I speak to people that have been in this sort of sector for a long time, a lot of stuff that they experienced were never vocalized. So, microaggressions is not a new occurrence, but it's a new acknowledged concept, where most people just thought that maybe that's okay. Maybe it was, you became immune to it and accepted that just that is. You don't fit in, therefore you're different. So they treat you differently. Now there is a definition of what it is and the impact it has. So people talk about it, and people say this is not okay, and where it's never been acknowledged that it wasn't okay to treat someone, to say comments like, where do you really come from? They never thought that actually has an impact on the individual, that they have to explain, justify that they're just entitled to be here as you are. And so that has changed quite a bit, and people can speak up about that's not okay. And I think that's a big change. And because people said, oh, I should have said more previously. And in those days, that wasn't probably going to be sort of paid attention as much. A lot of people thought it was in their head. They said that somebody said something that upset me, and somebody will say, oh, they didn't really mean it. And that was it. So then you kind of just took that, it doesn't mean that you couldn't go on with life, but you just accumulated all of this stuff that others people didn't have to deal with. So I think that has changed. And I'm glad that people may experience less of it, because now it's in the open, that people saying you need to be aware that anything you say potentially could have an impact, and are you aware of it? It doesn't mean that you have to be sent to a different camp so you learn not to say those things, but just being aware, being able to talk to people. I think it's hopefully is a change for the better. So that's a little bit of what my observations have been about that.
I think something that you brought up I've never really thought about before is the fact that now we have language to explain and address these problems. Whereas before, like you were saying in your examples, you're gaslighting yourself into saying, oh, it can't be that bad, it'll be all right. Whereas now, like the fact that we have definitions of gaslighting, microaggressions, like you can actually pinpoint, no, this is wrong because like this is what this means and we shouldn't be tolerating this. So I do think that's something interesting that I've not really thought about before. I wanted to ask, do you think that like institutions have like a responsibility? Well, okay, so for me as a student, we have a lot of professional development strand courses where we have to talk a lot about communication and a lot of reflection. And there's a big thing now about, well, at least in my experience of being a student, about making sure that you're reflecting on your actions. Things didn't go your way, okay, unfortunately sometimes that's going to be the case, but what can you reflect on to make sure that this doesn't happen again in the future? And I think as the career choice that we're in, the sector we're in, being a vet, that is something that you have to address. And I think that that's something that wasn't really taught about beforehand. You kind of just taught like the knowledge and the education in the textbooks, like you need to know this, whereas now I think there is a really big shift into the reflection, making sure that you're able to improve beyond the knowledge. Like, okay, you made a mistake, how can we make sure that this mistake doesn't happen again, and teach it to other people so that they don't make the same mistakes? So do you think the fact that now there is a shift in teaching students incoming about awareness, do you think that's got something to do with the change in perspective now, or do you think that's something that we're going to see in the future as a change? And also, second part to the question, do you think as institutions we should be doing, alongside the professional development strand type communication sessions, we should be doing about discrimination and racism as well as communication? Because I think it all does kind of fit into the same thing. And I know you said we don't necessarily need to have like sessions about you can't say these words, like this is offensive, but do you think that is something that should be implemented in general, like not necessarily in veterinary, just in life. Like if you're having communication sessions, you should also have discrimination sessions and racism sessions in all, like discrimination, all forms, like disability, sexism, stuff like that. Do you think that's something that we should be doing?
Yeah, so I think one of the observations is I do think that the veterinary profession has awoken to the value of the reflective practitioner. And you're right, a couple of generations, there was no such thing in veterinary sort of spectrum that you talk anything more than the science. And I can't speak for how the other professions sort of awoken to this sort of realization that the benefit of having reflective aspects to what we do, how we improve ourselves. But that's definitely embedded now. And I think hopefully our students can appreciate that we're not trying to just put a token session here and there. We're trying to make sure that as you develop your scientific skills, your reflective skills are developing as well, because the reflective practitioner can cope with all sorts of stresses in life, not just about their profession. And because we're in higher education, I think it's our duty to make sure that the people that we are helping develop into members of society have those skills beyond their trade. And in how we do that is being open about what to include in our training, because it's not just about making you a better vet, but perhaps making you a better person. And so one of the themes that we put in the task group recommendations is about investing in personal development. That is not just about going to course and boom, you're fixed. It's about developing you and having opportunities to engage in different activities that appeal to you. So rather than having like one mandatory course, we have like a whole catalog that you could pick and choose and help develop yourself so that you can support colleagues and students. And I think that that's the part where a lot of people were terrified. They're like, I have no idea what to say.
Yeah.
If someone has a problem. And we said, well, we need to help people develop a comfort level, not become experts in dealing with these issues, but be able to understand the language around it, giving the vocabulary to say, what they're experiencing. And so I think that that's good. That's one way to benefit the whole sector. And, the veterinary profession is not very diverse, and we're not going to get, change that overnight, but we need to prepare the profession to be able to cope with being more diverse. So things have to happen in all different areas in order to really progress things. So I think that is very true. In terms of, what should be adopted in the curriculum, the most interesting part of this process that I've been involved was I expected that we investigate, we'll produce a report, and we would have to wait a long time before results happen. And that was not what was happening. As we were having conversations, people were already thinking of how to change things. So rather than wait for like a report and some sort of endorsement and action plans, it was like, I can do this. I can introduce this in my teaching. So I was really, happy that people were not waiting for someone to tell them to do something different. A lot of people are saying, the communication skill session, we can add that in, that element of how do you deal with either a colleague or the vet or the client, and having the ability to recognize that there are differences in cultural sort of processing of information that may impact how that session goes. So that was, to me, really gratifying to see that people were willing to make changes right away rather than wait until some sort of guidance came down to say, you need to be more inclusive in your teaching. So I think that benefit will start being apparent much quicker than I thought, which I'm really glad about.
Hearing that makes me feel so like hopeful for me as a current student, the people currently at the RVC, staff, students, like everyone. It's just making me really hopeful for the future, the fact that people care about this and want to do things now. And I think one theme that you picked up on was exposure. Like, as an ethnic minority, you're exposed to discrimination because of the nature of it, and the fact that you have to be able to deal with these situations. You acquire the skills to be able to have a conversations with people who are being, aggressive and stuff like that. But if you're also friends with other ethnic minorities, you're able to communicate how you're feeling about negative situations and try and you have that sort of comfort and support from other people who can not necessarily go through the same thing, but can relate to your experience. So I think the exposure of people who wouldn't have had that if they're not ethnic minorities, or they don't have ethnic minority friends and they're not exposed to discrimination and racism, why would they think that this is an issue? How is this if it doesn't directly affect their lives? I feel a lot of people, it's not something they would think about on a daily basis, because why would they? They're doing other things. So I think, if we're implementing these sorts of things in the curriculum with communication skills and giving people the tools to be good allies, for I'm not necessarily going to face discrimination, but how can I help someone if I'm witnessing it? What can I do to help someone else? Like, what language? And I think being able to give people the language and the skills to be able to deal with situations is going to help more people, so that other ethnic minorities don't have to suffer and be the only ones, and they have to speak up, because it can be terrifying having to speak up in a situation that's very confrontational and aggressive. But if you have other people who can try and de-escalate the situation, who know the language to handle that, I think that will make more of a difference. And it also involves everyone in the issue, because I feel like a lot of times when we're doing these sorts of things, it's left to ethnic minorities to find a solution to a problem that we've not caused. So I think being able to involve everyone in the solution is the best way forward. So hearing that makes me feel very hopeful for the future. What were some of the other recommendations that the report produced? Just anything that you think was interesting.
So it's quite a big report. So the one going back to when you were asked to take on this task, we knew that there were so many areas that we can get involved. So what we actually did is sort of broke the task into different contexts. So, what about the people? What about the educational mission? What about the structure of the organization? So, and the recommendations sort of are in every sector of so that it's not just in one area that there'll be a change. We thought top to bottom, there needs to be visibility and constant messaging, because what we didn't want it to be is 2020 we did something and that's it. It's a footnote. So we wanted to have changes that were long term, that was developmental, not accept, there's no tick box. It's more about, okay, so even if you achieve this year, what are you going to achieve thereafter? Because it's a continuum. And I think that a lot of the recommendations were about that. One, for example, is about constant messaging. We shouldn't have to wait until Black History Month to hear something. It should be constant. It should be normal. It should be okay to have diversity questions, inclusivity issues discussed all the time. So I think those are the hopeful things that we can see take hold.
And I think that again comes back to exposure. It's the more we make these sorts of issues not highlighted, but shine a light on them, the more we pass the mic to people to to talk about these things, I think the more progress we'll be able to make. So that, again, I'm really happy hearing you say these things. They make me feel very hopeful for the future. I know you said that there are changes happening a lot faster than you were thinking or expected to, but what is your hope for when the report gets published? What is your hope for the future?
Well, first of all, I think I'm hoping really that people will view it as very bold and inclusive, meaning that whatever contribution they had to it was sort of reflected in that, so that I wanted to make sure that it wasn't just one small viewpoint, that it was this sort of all encompassing. So it's quite substantive, much bigger than I thought it was going to be. And And I think people hopefully can see how they themselves can contribute to this mission rather than it's somebody else to sort out. Like, because there's enough things that is not just institutional, but individual people so they can develop themselves and be more comfortable being not only around people for minorities, but also support them.
Yeah.
And how do they can show that they are for equality and inclusivity, and point out that the things that they can do to help the situation. So that's what I'm most hopeful that people will take from it.
I think another theme that gets brought up in life that I'm really picking up on the moment is support. The support networks you have help you to become a better person, but also support from institutions helping students now, whether they are ethnic minorities facing discrimination, like making sure that there are routes that they can go to, whether it's you're in a profession, you're facing discrimination, like what can you do to make sure that this doesn't happen again and this gets better, and supporting like other people, the non-ethnic minorities, to be able to have the language to communicate through. So I think all through this conversation, like the main theme that keeps coming up is being able to support every area of like the intersections of society. So I think this has been a really lovely conversation. Thank you so much for joining me. My final question to you is, what life mottos / philosophies have you, like, do you think has helped you get through your very successful career?
Well, I think perhaps a reflection of this past year. I think the thing that keeps coming to mind is never be limited by labels.
Yeah.
Because labels can be assigned, but sometimes people adopt labels, and that actually can be limiting. And I think, so I think that's the theme motto that I will go to for a while, is don't be limited by labels.
And I think that is a universal theme that anyone can relate to, because labels don't necessarily have to be about like discrimination. They could literally just be about like, oh, like I'm labeled as something, but like, I don't want to fit into that. And I don't know, I think that's a really interesting way of not boxing yourself and your potential. Like, you have so much more to give. You don't have to limit yourself, because I feel like a lot of the reflection work that we've had to do recently on the course and stuff that I've been reflecting on is like very self-deprecation. I feel like everyone needs to learn to be their biggest fan and to hype themselves up, because a lot of the times you're like, oh no, I can't, or I wouldn't be able to do that. And it's like, no, you can. What's the worst that's going to happen? Like, you should give it a try. So I really like that. It's very nice. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I think this has been a really interesting conversation. I think having seen the task force, like being at uni before the task force creation, granted it was only for a year, but still, and then having experienced all of the Black Lives Matter movement, and then seeing the creation of the task force and like the completion, and just hearing, I was seeing all the emails that you were putting out, and from like a student perspective who wasn't involved, like seeing that made me feel like something was actually happening. And then speaking to you today and like hearing all the stuff that is being put in place, and people do really care about this, has been really comforting, and I hope that it also comforts other people. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to have this conversation with me. I really appreciate it.
No, my pleasure, absolute pleasure. And I've been really impressed by the work that Animal Aspirations have done, and you guys should really be proud of what you're doing. So thank you.
I will pass the message on to the rest of the team, because it is very much a team effort. Well, I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Bye. Take care.
That was a really interesting episode, and I hope that from listening to Dan speak, you feel, like me, hopeful for the future and the change that the profession has been and is willing to make. Tackling institutional racism is not something that will happen overnight, but I hope that from listening to this conversation, it has opened your eyes as to how the individualistic approach can cause change. The veterinary profession is not very diverse, but by tackling these issues, we can make sure that future generations who want to become vets don't have to suffer negatively like their predecessors. There are lots of people and organizations who are actively creating change within the profession, and seeing how we're all doing different things but with the same goal makes me very hopeful for the future. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Animal Aspirations Podcast, and we'll see you next time.